Is it going to be 2050? That's the question. Mr. Pimble, would you like to respond on that? Is it going to be 2015 or is it going to be 2050?
No, I would agree that the progressive legislation that the government of India has taken up in last 10 years. Now India is no more aid dependent, it is not debt trapped, it is not dependent on only external resources via trade. So that is a very positive sign. Today, one of the major schemes, Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee schemes, is in the world the highest social protection scheme. But the challenge, in my opinion, is to look at in a disaggregated way, to bring in the whole issue of gender, to bring in the whole issue of marginalized and excluded groups, to bring in the whole issue of the marginalized regions. Because there is a growing inequity. The recent report which is launched by the Government of India, Ministry of Statistics, it's a very good step. That report itself acknowledges that the last quintil, the bottom 20% is actually doing much worse than many of the other parts. So as Nisha and Ashok and Santosh has been talking about. So the challenge is in the implementation.
So what's the difficulty in these Bimaru states, as we have called it, that as even Mr. Mehrotra said, that you are giving in strong allocations, you are giving in high allocations, but when it comes to implementation of the scheme, when it comes to how these allocations are being utilized, why the Bimaru states are lacking behind?
I think, Natasha, you are pointing out to a very correct thing. It's the issues of implementation, the slippages, leakages, corruption. I think we have to start very bluntly talking about these issues and tackling them bottom up, because lot of these resources which are allocated, lot of the positive policy measures that Government of India is taking, if it is not translating into real goods and services for those who need it the most, then
but the benefits we have is you're talking about the decentralized nature of our schemes. We can improve local governance the way we did it in Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, also by involving social audit and public hearing. Not to forget, this is a country which is giving its citizens right to information, right to work, right to food, right to education. So everything has become a right. But in that scenario, how realistic are these goals? Right to education, we've already hearing states are saying that they don't have much allocation, they don't have much money to actually spend on something like RTE. Does that the center state, the federal nature of the country also at times pose a problem?
I would say Santosh would be best to answer something like this.
You're right. Of course, there are problems in a extremely diverse and large country like ours, and the fact that we are a federation makes our system of governance more complicated than, for instance, in China. China is not just a one-party state, it is also a unitary constitution. We have a federal constitution, and it makes our system of governance much more difficult. We are also more diverse than China. But let me return to a point that was made by several speakers here, whether it's sort of implementation or is it design. I think we can achieve the MDGs in our country if we improve the design of our programs. It's not simply a question of implementation and poor governance.
What do you mean by design of the program?
I'm coming to that. You see, for instance, we have examples in our delivery system of excellent design. NREGA is a very well designed program, and it has actually been very successful in its goals, in achieving its goals. But I'll give you at least two other national programs which have direct relevance to the MDGs, which are designed very badly and which need to be reformed. For instance, you will not be able to address hunger if you do not reform the targeted public distribution system. So you have the reform, unless you reform the PDS, you will not get to achieve lower levels of hunger. Secondly, child malnutrition levels are very high in our country, and they're just not going down, despite the fact that we've had a 35-year-old history of a program which is intended to address that, the Integrated Child Development Program. Now, ICDS is a very poorly designed program. We have suggested a new design for it in the 11th five-year plan. The ministry has to implement it. The state governments have to implement it. If they do not, child malnutrition will not go down.
We always say that we have the best policy makers in the world, but when it comes to policies and their implementation, somewhere we fail. It's now time for us to take a short break. Next, when we come back, we'll talk about the role of developed countries in helping developing countries achieving these Millennium Development Goals. Stay tuned.
दिल्ली में एनसीसीएफ, नैफेड, मदर डेयरी के सफल आउटलेट्स और केंद्रीय भंडार की चुनिंदा दुकानों में उपलब्ध।
back. You're watching Public Forum and we are discussing the Millennium Development Goals. How far India has progressed in achieving these goals? How practical is the inclusive growth concept? Now we're talking about the responsibilities of developed countries in achieving these goals. Is there a crisis of unity in worldview about the most fundamental issues that concerns us all, reinforcing the fact that difference between developing and developed world is deep? Coming to you, Mr. Pimple, again. Is there a crisis in world unity when you talk about Millennium Development Goals? Do we see there's a clear-cut line drawn that we are going to help you only to a certain level, but not really in achieving the goals?
Actually, it's very interesting to see that the Goal 8, which is called Global Partnership, was specifically designed for the rich countries to deliver on their commitments on aid, which is 0.7% of their gross national income, with the improved quality, where the aid is not dependent on the donor's whims and fancies, but the recipient country's needs and priorities. Second is debt cancellation. That was the second commitment that the rich countries gave. And the third commitment that they gave is to make trade, global trade, more fair and just. So these are the three kind of commitments that the rich countries gave to the developing world. That was in a way the kind of a new compact between the rich and the poor globally.
Now, so if I have to give you an example here, like the aid promised to Africa, the G8 promised to double aid by 2010, increasing aid to Africa by $25 billion. But if we look at the figures, it says it has only increased by a quarter, in comparison to what it had actually earlier committed. So how do you actually improve and pester the developed nations to contribute?
Yeah, and that is why Millennium Campaign works also in the developed countries, in countries of Europe, in North America, so that those citizens also push their governments to keep the promise on the issue of Goal 8, on the issue of keeping their promises and keeping their commitments. Because ultimately the political mobilization of the citizens enforcing and holding their governments to account for the achievement of MDGs, I think is the most critical factor towards achievement of MDGs, because that is what needs to be done. And there is a unity in pledges, but there is no unity in delivery. So the challenge again are very good pledges are made, very good promises are made. That is the 2005 Gleneagles pledge, what you are referring to. But delivery, no
delivery, implementation. Mr. Bharti, someone who's very closely working at the grassroots level, what problems do you see? Do you really feel that this whole inclusive growth concept can really become a reality in a country as diverse as ours?
No, I do believe that this can really become a reality, but we need to see whether the political commitment is there, whether the administrative commitment is there, and whether the financial commitments are there, because normally when we talk about the political commitment, the financial commitment are kept separately. So if we want to make an inclusive growth, then we have to define inclusive growth in terms of resource allocation through the budgetary allocation and through the planned allocation. Unfortunately, that is the area which we need to really look into.
And we've always focused on civil society involvement. Do you feel like, especially in schemes like MNREGA, when we involved the civil society, they really felt empowered, they felt as if they were part of the same scheme and they could really speak up, and even the officials who were responsible for implementing those schemes, there was a fear. You could instill that fear in the implementing officials. So on that level, do you feel it's important that you have to involve civil society?
I guess it is very, very critical, particularly in a parliamentary democracy which India is, that the involvement of the people is central to the success of attainment of their rights. Unfortunately, it has not happened, and in fact the MNREGA is the first law which really enforces, which really in fact compel the government to fulfill its obligation if people demands. But I have one small, the issue with that unfortunately the Indian psyche is still of the my-baap psyche, and government has to really invest hugely to ensure that people get rid of this my-baap psyche and they consider the bureaucracy and the political executive and the government as an instrument of delivering results.
What do you mean by this? Are you saying that it's the government who's ultimately responsible for actually doing things or for changing the way things are?
Absolutely.
This is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, another thing what is being said, Ms. Agrawal, here is that climate change, issues like climate change, recession, has really made achieving Millennium Development Goals difficult. Do you feel that MDGs have been affected because of these problems?
Actually, what you said earlier, we are talking about two preconditions necessary for attaining the MDGs. One, we talked about political will.